We're pleased to have today with us, as I mentioned, three distinguished speakers, so I'll introduce them in turn. Cathy Woollums is a Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Berkshire Hathaway Energy. Berkshire Hathaway, as you know, is a holding company that also owns a number of energy companies, renewable energy companies, transmission, and utilities, from Pacific Core now to NV Energy, Rocky Mountain Power, and others. And I think one of her slides lists all of the Berkshire Hathaway companies. So Berkshire Hathaway and MidAmerican have a unique perspective on the opportunities and the challenges in the West. Wyoming among the states within the footprint, but I will go a little farther afield today and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities west-wide. So thank you for being here. Mark Lauby is a Vice President and Director for Reliability at NERC. And as you know, NERC is charged by Congress with ensuring the reliability of the grid. It was established after the brownout in 2003. And so, you know, we've had a couple since then, but not very many. And that is thanks to the work that Mark and his staff do. NERC has played an important role and continues to lead in partnership with EPA on addressing reliability issues under the Clean Power Plan. And Jay Caspary with the Southwest Power Pool. Jay, I should have mentioned that Mark is an electrical engineer, as is Jay. And both have assured me that if you just give this problem to the engineers, they can solve it. So they will have, I think, some good recommendations and solutions for you today. As I mentioned, Jay is with the Southwest Power Pool, which will include Wyoming and the Dakotas, North and South Dakota. When does that happen, Jay? October of this year. So Jay has a special interest in Wyoming and in addressing some of the concerns that I know you all have with respect to costs and reliability, and he'll speak to that in a minute. I just want to outline for you, kind of the broad subject areas that we hope to address today. This isn't exhaustive, but think about these areas. Some of these questions came up during Joe's remarks or after Joe's remarks. They'll come up again as you hear the brief presentations this afternoon and then in my questions. But we want to address these topics because I think they're the most germane and relevant to Wyoming. Again, this is not intended to limit your questions, but I just wanted to kind of give you a roadmap or an outline of where we hope to go. Number one, regional coordination. What are the opportunities for Wyoming in particular to partner and coordinate with neighboring states? And that's true throughout the West. Number two, reliability, and I've alluded to that already. Number three, transmission. Does the Western transmission grid have the capacity to start to integrate renewables at scale, to deal with coal retirements, and how do we address cost allocation issues and some of the costs of upgrading the transmission system to meet the goals of the Clean Power Plan? Number four, policy and markets. To a large degree, energy policy drives markets. It is true that load and the private markets are the ultimate consumer here, but policy matters. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm referring, among other things, to Governor Brown's 50% renewable energy goal in California. Number five, the future of coal. We've heard a lot from Ben Yamagata and Julio Friedman and others on the future of coal, so we'll spend some time on that. And last but not least, impact on rates. So those are kind of the six topics that I've asked our panelists to address. But again, feel free to ask questions beyond those if they come up. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cathy, who will start us off. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And thank you all for allowing me to be back here in Wyoming again. I think over the past 7 years, I've covered a lot of miles in the state and met nothing but wonderful people and can see the opportunities that exist here in the state. Also being from a small state, I'm based in the state of Iowa. I'm not based in DC, so we have a lot of synergies there. And just want to tell you briefly, to start out, about Berkshire Hathaway Energy. The slide you see before you here just demonstrates what our 6 core principles are. Everything that we do essentially revolves around these 6 core principles of customer service, employee commitment, environmental respect, regulatory integrity, operational excellence, and financial strength. And that contributes to our vision of being the best energy company in serving our customers while delivering sustainable energy solutions. I could probably stop there and let others talk about 111D, but I'll take you through just a couple slides, kind of as a refresher, I think, for most of you on 111D, and give you some of our thoughts that we've seen as we've gone through our analysis and submitted our comments. Now, what we have here is the whole portfolio of assets that are under the Berkshire Hathaway Energy umbrella. We have 4 electric operating companies, 3 of which are regulated. Steve referenced PacifiCorp, Rocky Mountain Power, Pacific Power, and PacifiCorp Energy. Those are our operating entities here, primarily Utah, Wyoming, but also Idaho, California, Oregon, and Washington. And with respect to those latter states, obviously, I think there's a very dramatic difference in philosophy. And we kind of straddle that, trying to come up with good solutions for all our customers in all those states as we develop our solutions or our perspectives on various rulemakings. We have a Midwestern utility, Mid-American Energy, which is the largest rate-regulated owner of wind generation in the country. As of 2016, when we complete our next round of wind projects, our wind generation, or our renewable generation capacity, will be 50% of our total capacity on that system. And I know some of you are saying, how can that be? We've had a convergence of many policies to contribute to that, and it's actually a pretty remarkable feat when you think about that. We acquired NV Energy, based in Nevada, a little over a year ago. We also have a renewable company formed in 2012 just to develop renewables as an independent power producing company, and it owns what is currently the largest solar project in the world. Also, under sort of that renewables umbrella, we have an independent power producing company that operates in various locations. We have 2 natural gas transmission pipelines, Kern River Gas Transmission and Northern Natural Gas. And we recently just closed a electric transmission deal called AltaLink up in Alberta. We also have operations in the United Kingdom as well as the Philippines. So our reach is pretty broad, and we recognize that within that reach we have an environmental responsibility, as you see, or had seen on the previous slide, a core of our environmental respect principles. Now, I think you're probably all familiar with the 4 building blocks of the 111D proposal. So I won't go into any detail there, but clearly, 4 building blocks applied uniformly across the states, but also in recognition of the fact that states start in various positions, and as a result, they probably end up in very different positions as well. Timeline, I think you're all familiar with the general timeline, that we're looking at a final rule, as Joe said, sometime this summer. State plans coming due within a year to 2 years after that, depending on the circumstances, and then potentially 1 additional year if states move forward to go into a regional type agreement from an implementation standpoint. Ultimately, leading up to the 2020 effective date and that 2020 to 29 date for those interim goals, and then culminating in 2030. I wanted to give you a sense of where our companies have generation, our operating companies, and the relative differences, where those states land in terms of the requirements under the Clean Power Plan as it stands today. I think we have both the lowest and the highest emission rate in terms of the state of Washington at 215 pounds per megawatt hour in 2030 as the final goal. I did not list the interim targets on here. And then, of course, we do have an ownership share in a facility in Montana, which has, I believe, the highest emission rate, or second highest emission rate. Those rates certainly informed our comments as we drafted those. And we actually, much to my chagrin, but justifiably so, submitted 4 separate sets of comments, one for each of our operating companies, because they had various state dynamics, political drivers, et cetera, that needed to be taken into consideration. And there was a recognition at the Berkshire Hathaway Energy level that we had to both respect those political aspects as well as recognize them and advocate on behalf of our customers in those various states. So all 4 sets of comments were different. I did my best to ensure that those 4 sets of comments were not in conflict with one another, but I'm sure the EPA would tell me if I was wrong on that. This is just a graphic depiction. If you look at the US in general, which I think is kind of an important dynamic here, of where they start in terms of the 2012 baseline fossil rate, and then what each of those relative building block contributions are ultimately nationwide to get to the end point. And I think Joe Goffman said something very telling here, and maybe it's a little bit of subliminal messaging or something, but we really kind of have to look at, where is the country supposed to land at the end of this? And kind of keep that in the backs of our minds as we move forward to potentially tailoring solutions to get through this process, assuming, notwithstanding legal challenges and everything else, because we've got to assume, from a company standpoint, we've got to assume that this thing's going to be implemented, and we need to be prepared to do that. And we need to provide the requisite level of input to ensure that we're advocating on behalf of our customers, to ensure that we're coming up with solutions that are the most cost-effective solutions. As we look at those building blocks then as applied to Wyoming, you can see that the mix is very, very different in terms of what potentially creates the biggest potential opportunity in theory as you apply those building blocks. So you can see the biggest chunk there is on the front of expanding renewable energy. Now if we look at the next slide, and I take our Utah generation, you see that the biggest contributor toward achieving that final goal is in the redispatch to natural gas side. So again, I just want to emphasize that different states are going to come from this from different angles, and of course recognize that they don't have to use any of these building blocks. If they don't, I don't know how they're going to get to their final goals, but ultimately they can use all of them, they can use any of them, they can use none of them. And that'll be an important dynamic moving forward as the states really do develop their plans. One of the other areas that I think is really key is the development of the renewable energy targets and those calculations. Ultimately the West, and certainly within the state of Wyoming, utilizing the approach that EPA used in its primary methodology, a 21% renewable energy target was established for the West. A couple observations there. The West is very large. The West is very diverse, and there are more opportunities in certain parts of the West than others. But nonetheless, you could see how these various regions were broken down and what their targets are. EPA also looked, however, particularly in the Notice of Data Availability that came out in October, at alternatives. And what you see on the slide in front of you is those various alternatives and how dramatically some of the state targets may change as EPA contemplates whether or not to adopt one of those various alternatives. Certain states come out better off, and other states come out much, much worse off in terms of potentially having an additional contribution on the renewable side. So this is, I think, a key area that is not yet final that will impact a lot of other areas as states do their planning. Our overall approach to the comments, as I said, we did submit the 4 sets of comments, but we tried to provide a constructive tone. We did not come out saying this is the worst thing you could possibly do, because I think that we need to find ways to work constructively And if we don't come out with constructive suggestions, what will happen is all the other groups that are pushing for the more stringent requirements are going to take the contra position. That's the only position that EPA would hear then. And I think, as you heard, coming out with some constructive suggestions is a positive thing. We believe that overall the 2030 goals are achievable. Now, that doesn't mean in every circumstance, that doesn't mean that the rule doesn't need to be tweaked in certain respects, but ultimately we think there are some real possibilities to achieve the final targets. However, there are some really key issues that we believe also need to be addressed, and one is the remaining useful life of a source. That is within the regulatory construct of 111D, and we think that we need to have EPA take into consideration particularly what the life of a source is when we've just made some very significant emission control investments. We're in the midst of mercury and air toxic standards that you heard about earlier. We're also, not the least of which is installing some pretty major controls for purposes of compliance with regional haze requirements. We don't want to have to shut those facilities down when we just made millions and millions of dollars of investments in those facilities. So we think that's a really important part of EPA's thought process moving forward. We also suggested that EPA consider removing those interim targets, the 20 to 29, and just having states meet the 2030 target, or phasing in building blocks 1 and 2. Because particularly in certain states, there's a real cliff that happens basically beginning in 2020. And I think from a reliability standpoint, and others I'm sure will talk about this, there are some serious concerns with respect to immediately cutting to those first 2 building blocks and getting those in place. Third point, it's really important to respect existing state processes. And particularly when states have integrated resource planning requirements, for Pacific Corps' purposes, they have a multi-state process or protocol where that allows us within the 6 states that we operate to utilize all those assets within the fleet as system assets. And it might not be the best process, but it's a workable process. And we'd like to see an opportunity to be able to use a similar type process to comply with 111D. And then lastly, I already hit on this topic, the renewables approach is very important. Interstate issues, I won't go into these, but as we think about the transmission of electricity across state borders, we certainly don't stop green or brown electrons at any point in time, although some would like to do that. But there's a whole host of interstate issues that I think we have to deal with, despite the fact that the emission targets were calculated on a state-by-state basis. Lastly, I think that the whole 111D proposal creates many, many risks and opportunities. And you really have to look at it both from the standpoint of glass half empty and glass half full. Litigation, as a recovering litigator myself, I'll tell you that I'm not sure that that's the best way to effectuate policy. And sometimes it really scares me when I see some of the court decisions that come out, because once something goes into that litigated process, we to a certain extent lose control over it, and you never know what judge is going to think something on a particular day. So I feel like we don't have as much control over the process once it gets to the litigation standpoint. Changes in the underlying proposal, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Anybody's guess, my hope is that it will be a positive thing and that our comments will have been taken seriously. But some of the things too, I think that we'll touch on further are some of the multi-state agreements and whether there are benefits or disbenefits there. Just overall how the states themselves implement the compliance obligations. And I know that there are some real concerns on public power and municipal power agencies, et cetera, that whether they can or can't do the same things that as investor-owned utilities can do. How do we treat plant retirements or unit retirements? What do we do to make sure that we can continue to grow, continue to foster the economic drivers that are so important to all of us? And then lastly, just kind of a sleeper issue out there, but it's becoming more and more important, particularly in some states, is what do we do with this whole distributed generation thing? Where, we haven't quite reconciled what to do with it just in terms of integration on the system, but how do we take advantage of that in terms of 111D compliance? So with that, I am at the end of my slides, and I'll turn it over to our next panelist.
Thank you, Cathy, very much. And we'll come back to Cathy. I hope that's not me. We'll come back to Cathy specifically to talk about strategies that might be important for Wyoming to think about in developing an implementation plan and in working with the EPA precisely to take advantage of its enormous world-class wind resources, natural gas, but also the clean coal opportunities. And I agree with Cathy that litigation itself, while important, is not a strategy. It's the first line of defense, if you will, and I understand the position of the state of Wyoming with respect to the proposed rule. But we'll want to talk with Cathy and the other panelists a little bit about what is the right backup plan? What is the plan for developing an implementation plan that would satisfy EPA, in the next 4 to 6 years? Hard to hear? Okay. Thanks, Lloyd. I'll stop talking and turn it over to Mark.
Good afternoon. I'm at an AC/DC concert here, which of course is really related to engineering, is it not? That's right. And I am a recovering engineer, so if I start talking about real and imaginary power, bear with me. I will try to avoid those terms, but that's how you're taught this stuff in engineering school. Those of you I don't have heard of NERC before, we've been around since 1968 actually as an organization, which resulted from some of the blackouts in the Northeast. It was a way to coordinate planning, coordinate operations over time throughout North America. Initially it was just the United States. And over time, there became more and more a need for industry to start setting standards of performance, et cetera, so that they could, count on each other. So they had certain criteria or rules they would work together on. For example, the famous N-1, for example, the next worst contingency will operate to that, et cetera. And so, and then, of course, from that time period on until about 2005, we were pretty much a voluntary organization in North America. As a result of the Energy Power Act of 2005, though, it was called for an electric reliability organization which would focus solely on reliability. Now, it was in the works probably in the latter part of the 90s because markets were being formed, companies were being, as we used to say, delaminated or de-aggregated, and it wasn't really clear who owned reliability anymore. It used to be just the vertically integrated organization. But is it the distribution company, is it the generator, is it the transmission company, et cetera? And so there was a lot of conversation. Then the 2003 blackout occurred. I appreciate you called it a brownout. I feel better. And that really kind of, laid, a lot of energy behind developing this electric reliability organization. So we set standards for reliability. Everything as techy as what's the frequency response you're going to have, and how reliable is that system going to operate, all the way into how you plan the system, how relays are going to work, et cetera. And those standards are written by industry, and then they commit to follow them. And if they don't follow them, then there is a potential for a fine. And that is through our compliance activity. And then finally, we also assess reliability, either looking backward, looking at trends, gathering data and information about the performance of the system, and then looking forward. We fall underneath the direction of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and of course we submit our standards to them, et cetera. We also have oversight in Canada. Each one of the provinces are kind of like their own little country when it comes to electric power, and we just got a wee bit of Mexico there in Baja. So that's NERC. We have 8 regions. Southwest Power Pool is one of them, of course, and my colleague here, Jay, will talk a little bit about some of the study work they've been doing there. So we've got a long history of assessing reliability. It is, again, one of the three core functions that NERC performs. We assess reliability in multiple different ways. One, of course, way is to look the season ahead and what's happening. Are we ready for the upcoming season for gas, for fuel, for, you know, what's the projected hotspots in North America as far as transmission loading, et cetera. Or we look long term. We put our binoculars on and we really look 10 years out. And what are the implications of the current set of you know, rules for operating the system, or what are some of the challenges, what are some of the technologies that are coming on board, how does that impact our outlook? And then we also look at different scenarios, especially when we start looking at new technologies, be it smart grid, new legislation, et cetera, and say, well, what are the implications there? Remember, we own reliability, and we need to be convinced. That's our job, and of course working with industry and FERC and state regulators, our job to ensure that the system remains reliable. That's, you know, you see the bottom, reliability and accountability. We feel like we're accountable for reliability. We've also looked at EPA regulations in the past, you know, 316B for those people who remember that one, that's with the water. And we did a couple studies there. We also looked at climate change, and I don't know why it says the impacts of impacts, it should be initiatives. We looked at climate change initiatives and what are some of the challenges there. And of course, you may be aware of our EPA study that we, I think, released about a year and a half, 2 years ago, where we looked at 4 rules, including MATS and 316B, among others. So what we're looking for is what are the retirements of generating plants? What are they going to be replaced with? And is every megawatt is not equal, you know, what are the changes in that overall characteristic of the bulk power system? A megawatt of energy efficiency is not equal to a megawatt of generation. It may be from a resource calculation perspective, from a reserve margin perspective, but it doesn't necessarily contribute the same characteristics to reliability. So we did initially review the 111D based on the notice of public rulemaking, and that was really just looking at the 4 areas of the building blocks, you might say. Now, one thing I want to make clear, it's important to remember that we really are not an advocate for policy. You know, we're not going to make a judgment as to, you know, the science on climate change, et cetera. It's not really our role. You know, we don't promote a specific compliance approach. We don't advocate a policy for a utility, a generating facility. You know, we really just care about reliability. That's what we care about. We're technology agnostic. But we also want to make sure that the ultimate characteristics of this huge, nonlinear, dynamic system remain stable, and we were formed to avoid cascading in the bulk power system. So we must be convinced, we must make sure that the future in front of us, that system remains reliable. And you know, the good news is we're all on the same side here. You've heard that from Joe. You'll hear that from my colleagues here. I'm sure you all care about it too. Reliability is important to all of us. And so it's just a matter of how we get there, I think. So with that, then, of course, we did put that report together. We looked at each one of the 4 areas. We had some, identified some concerns, especially if you can't make one area, then it impacts the other areas, and how do you get these different plans? What are the infrastructure requirements going to be? When you translate yourself, you know, to, let's say, heavily to gas, do you have gas pipelines sufficient to support? Because this is just-in-time fuel. You know, a coal pile, you look at the back 40, you see it. It's there. There's your fuel. You know, gas is delivered unless you have a local storage facility nearby, pretty much just in time, and you're competing with other applications of gas, you know, like, for example, retail gas. And the way the rules are set for markets, which of course we have already provided our opinions on, sometimes we worry that gas being bought on spot, you know, you can't necessarily get gas when it's really cold, like the polar vortex, for example. Sometimes you can't get the supply, sometimes you can't get the delivery. So, you know, we want to make sure that you know, the gas pipelines are there, the transmission's going to be there. What are some of the issues we need to worry about? Because all that takes time to build. It all takes time. Unlike all y'all, not everybody likes a transmission line in their backyard. Go figure, you know. Or a wind turbine in the backyard. Or a gas pipeline in the backyard, right? So it takes time to build these and get the public supportive of making change. So we delivered that report, and in that we also then talked a little bit more about some more detailed analysis that we would like to do. And so our dilemma, of course, is we don't have the final rule. We have the existing notice of public rule. We have some supplemental information. We continue to have conversations with EPA. It's been delightful to have a chance to have a technical give and take. And then we are right now pulling together some case based on projections. You know, we only can project a transmission currently that's on the books because that's what people have projected to build now. They hadn't really necessarily thought about the implications of this particular set of rules. And we talk a little bit about the kind of model that we're using there. But the dilemma is that we're, just going to be able to do this go so far and then continue to work with the states over time to perhaps, come up with a follow-on study. And I'll get into that in a second. We'll also look at some of the transmission adequacy issues. My colleague Jay will talk a little bit about some of the work they've done there. Again, this is really around existing system and projected build-out, not necessarily any new system, because that's up to the states, that's up to the local utilities and what they're going to do. We only know what's on the books right now. And then, of course, review some of the existing studies. You've heard, I'm sure, some of the studies done in California, MISO, or Southwest Power Pool and others. Review those, look at what can we learn from the local sets of issues as well. That study, of course, it's just begun. And just gives you a little bit more background on the kind of casework that we'll be doing there. But, I think it's important for folks to understand that this is going to be just our first blush analysis, given load projections, generation projections. And remembering that like I mentioned before, not every megawatt's equal. So even a megawatt of variable generation or wind generation doesn't necessarily equate to thermal generation. And it's important for us to understand what the implications are, because we can make, as engineers, we can make wind act like fossil fire generation. It can synthesize some of the frequency response and inertial responses that we need. We need to be able to tell those that are building them what the criteria are, what we're looking for. And so we need to start measuring it, not just saying, be able to put 1 megawatt of wind equals 1 megawatt of coal-fired plant, but or gas-fired plant, but exactly what are the characteristics we're looking for. So here's an idea of what we'll be doing over the next year or so in our reliability assessments and performance analysis group, and we're shooting for around mid-April to early April for the target release for this phase 1 study that I just described to you. And then, of course, after that, looking forward and saying, well, when the final rule comes out and we start seeing some of the state implementation plans, taking a look at those as well and understanding what the implications will be on the power system, maybe do some dynamic studies as well as thermal, I'm sorry, I'm using engineering terms, looking transmission adequacy and looking at the stability of the system. And then potentially even a third study by December 2016, again, to increase our comfort level as the ERO, the Electric Reliability Organization, that the projected system remains reliable at the endpoint as well as during the transition. And so as we get more information, we'll be able to make those determinations and provide feedback to policymakers. We've already posted a study also on what we call essential reliability services. We would like policymakers to understand that when you replace a megawatt of a given generation with, let's say, a megawatt of renewable or variable generation, let's put it that way, that it's not a megawatt to megawatt exchange, and you need to consider other essential reliability services like frequency response, inertial response, and all the other engineering stuff that probably nobody really cares about. But it's very important to have that. You got it with the thermal plant. You got to be able to get it with the variable generation plants as well. So with that, I think that's my last slide, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mark. Be sure to turn off your mic. All right, Jay, I think you're good to go.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Thanks to the board for inviting me back, and Lloyd, it's always great to be back to see you and others. It's a privilege to be here in this panel, and I'm going to spend a few minutes to talk about Southwest Power Pool. And you're probably wondering why I'm here. I'm a power engineer out of Little Rock, Arkansas, and why does it matter what we do to Wyoming and others? And it does. Like Lloyd and others, Steve mentioned, the Laramie River Power Plant, which is not too far from here, is actually on the eastern grid. And it's a resource that's going to be serving load in the integrated system. It already serves some SPP load right now in Lincoln and some other towns in Nebraska. So what happens in Wyoming affects SPP, and engineers in Little Rock need to be engaged. SPP, we're a FERC-regulated independent system operator, and I'll show you some pictures here in a bit. One thing that's unique about our RTO, Regional Transmission Operator, is our governance. And if you look at the success we've had in getting transmission built, it's being driven primarily by our Regional State Committee, which is made up of regulators, the Public Utility Commission staff regulators, the commissioners, chairmen of the individual states. They work together, and they decide really important things for Southwest Power Pool, the region. They decide who pays for transmission. They decide critical things like capacity margins. How much reserves do you need in terms of resources across the footprint? So it's really important, I think, to recognize the success of our governance structure at Southwest Power Pool and keep that in mind as you move forward with tackling things like the Clean Power Plan. So let me just spend a little time giving you a little background, but this is our motto, and reliability is job one at Southwest Power Pool, and we work with our members to make sure we keep the lights on today and in the future. And it's not staff doing something on behalf of our members, it's working with our members and facilitating their decisions on how they want the energy marketplace to evolve, how they want our reliability rules to change over time. So that's really important. This is some data that we pulled together that reflects the emission rates that came out of the Clean Power Plan from June. If you started digging into the data, similar to what Cathy showed for some of her states, this is the overall SPP footprint in terms of average carbon dioxide emissions pounds per megawatt hour for SPP. From where we're at today and extrapolating up to 2019 and then seeing what the targets were starting in 2020 based on the EPA's models and then going out to 2030, which is the final goals. We're really worried about this glide path. It's a very disruptive thing to deal with in the power industry. We're very conservative. Utilities have to build long lead time infrastructure, very capital intensive, and we're really worried about this crash landing, going from the 2019 targets to the 2020 targets. And it's driven primarily because of the time it takes for us to approve new projects and get them built. We can't do this overnight, and you'll see that as the majority of our comments. But this is the data that shows what the targets would be for SPP today and how they'd grow over time and how they would be affected by the Clean Power Plan. It's easy we took some data from the EPA's models and the electric generation units. There's acronyms here, and I apologize. This was for engineers. So we pulled up data from the EPA's integrated planning model that showed here's what units would be retired under their scenarios. And as you see, this is the SPP footprint. You can see the majority of the unit retirements based on the EPA's models were large coal units on the eastern side of SPP. And that's not a surprise because that's where the majority of our loads are. Our major load centers are in Omaha, Kansas City, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Shreveport, towns like that, where the majority of our big coal generation fleet is. The other thing you'll notice too is that a lot of the big units that were being retired in the EPA's models weren't SPP units. They were just like one bus away in the adjacent system, but those big units like near Sioux Falls, Iowa there, or across the river from Omaha and Council Bluffs, Iowa, those units are not SPP units, but energy out of those units serves our load. So we need to be coordinating our plans with those folks. And that's one of the challenges with all of this. But you can see that there were some pretty big units being retired in the EPA's models, and we didn't want to, and like others comment, we're not making judgments on whether this is right or wrong. We're just trying to keep the lights on. And we're trying to respond to all resources agnostically. We really don't care what the source of the energy is. We just want to keep the lights on and make the market efficient as possible and do our job. So if you took those retirements that were in that model, in that graph I just showed you, and put that in a power flow model, which is a tool us engineers typically use to assess reliability, and then look at N-1 conditions, you can see that the southern portions of SPP were at risk of severe overloads, severe voltage problems, and probably cascading and brownouts, if not blackouts, in the southern extremities of Southwest Power Pool. So this was indicative to us that we've got problems. We need new resources, we need new transmission to be built, if in fact those EPA retirements do happen. We don't know if they will or not, but that was the assumption in their model, and we're just testing it. So those were our results. And here's a key slide for us. It takes us a long time to agree on a study to even start, to scope out a study with assumptions, what models we'll use, who we're going to coordinate. Before you even get the study done, it takes some time to agree to the study scope. But once we do a study and then go through our process of approving projects and then actually getting them built, it takes between 3 to 8.5 years for us to build infrastructure at Southwest Power Pool. So if we were going to have the rules come out here in 15 and people had to have state implementation plans in 16 or 17, depending upon whether they collaborated with their neighbors or not on the original schedule, clearly we didn't have enough time to have infrastructure built by 2020, if that were the case. So that kind of drove our comments. And these were the 4 major comments that we provided to the EPA back in October. First, we need technical conferences with FERC and EPA to discuss not only the reliability impacts, but the impacts of these changes on markets. Our regional market could be very disrupted if we had to take into account environmental dispatch. We didn't build this transmission system in this market based on those rule sets. We were trying to optimize the existing fleet and the economics of the grid. We need to move forward to accomplish both reliability and environmental objectives together. And we were encouraged by FERC setting up those workshops. The first one's happening in 2 weeks out here in DC on February 19th. And we're looking forward to, they're doing workshops for the East and the West and the central portions of the US later in March. And we're looking forward to that. The second big part is what Mark alluded to, and what I'm part of too, is this comprehensive national assessment of reliability. And we're really glad to see Mark and NERC take the lead on that and get that moving. We also do think that we need more time. There's no way we can be in compliance by 2020. We're either going to violate reliability rules or we're going to violate the emission targets. So give us more time and we can create a plan. We can solve this problem with time. But we don't want to rush to get a solution it's going to be very suboptimal and costly long term. The last thing is, in the ISOs, the independent system operators all work together, and we've been urging NERC and FERC and EPA and others to implement what we call a reliability safety valve. So if there's a part of the grid that has problems and we're worried about keeping the lights on, we want a potential waiver for an emission target, for example, so that we can actually have more time to get the right solution implemented. And we call that the reliability safety valve. That actually is getting some traction. If you read some of the comments from the EPA and others, they agree that we're not going to sacrifice reliability as we move forward. So that's really important. So where are we at today? Right now, we're in the process of doing an economic study, not just a reliability study, looking at a regional perspective. And what we want to do is to look at some scenarios of compliance, and not just take the EPA's retirements, but take our members' best guesses on resource plans and see, how do we move forward and how much time will it take us and cost to meet these goals long term. The second piece of that is to put together some reasonable estimates of timelines to build replacement capacity, to build out renewable energy if that's the right solution, part of the solution, as well as transmission infrastructure to accommodate that. If we start looking at not just regional solutions, but inter-regional solutions, that's going to take a lot more time than what we've experienced even just building transmission within SPP. So we need time to do bigger solutions if that's part of the answer. But we're here just to facilitate the dialogue, to help people understand the implications on reliability and economics, and perform studies that our regulators want us to see. The last piece is June. We hope to do a state-by-state comparison to compare against the regional solution that we'll have done hopefully by late March, and we'll share that in the upcoming workshop in St. Louis that the FERC's hosting on the Clean Power Plan. So with that, I think that's the end of my formal comments. I appreciate your attention. Look forward to the dialogue. I've got some links in the PowerPoint slides where you can go straight to the comments we filed as well as our formal study. If you're interested, get a hold of me if you've got any questions or comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. All right, let's get into the details. How can we move forward, construct a plan, develop a strategy, think about how to solve some of these challenges together? So I'm going to tee up the first question to the panel. We'll start with Cathy, but I'll invite answers from all of the panelists. And I just want to tee it up in the same way that Joe Goffman ended his answers to some of your questions. If you've studied EPA's emission reduction goals and the building block applications to the state of Wyoming, I think we can all agree it's not a good fit. Wyoming is unique in a number of ways. The governor mentioned many of them this morning. After Texas, the largest energy producer in the country, it's a net energy exporter by a long stretch, produces most of its electricity, including electricity that's exported to other states from coal, at about 89% from coal, 10% from wind. As you've heard from many people today, electricity doesn't follow or observe state lines. The transmission network in the West is complicated. It includes investor-owned utilities and public power, municipally owned co-ops, as well as other co-ops. The Mid-American footprint is a good illustration of that. But Joe, I don't think, gave a very good answer to the question, how does Wyoming get credit for the large renewable energy potential in the state, including renewable energy, wind energy that's exported out of Wyoming, and at the same time is penalized in effect for the coal generation in the state that is also exported. So there's an internal inconsistency there, and so that's the background. Here's the question. How do you understand, under the proposed rule, Cathy, what are the opportunities for regional cooperation? And EPA was deliberately vague, I think, in the mechanism in the rule for accounting for RECs, credits for emission reductions, sales of renewable energy across state boundaries. And so if you could start that conversation, what are the opportunities in the West for a state that's unique, like Wyoming, to partner with some neighboring states to reach the emission goals, but at an affordable cost?
Well, gee, now that I have the weight of the world on my shoulders, and maybe I should work at EPA so I can solve these problems. But I think there are a lot of opportunities for regional coordination, and when people talk about that, they think in terms of something more formal. You can think about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. That took years to put together. And you had states that were all similar mindsets, for the most part similarly situated, so it was a lot easier to achieve consensus. They also had to all pass some needed state legislation, some needed regulation. Again, that took years to get into place. In this circumstance, we don't necessarily have years, number one. And number two, we have to look at the realities of where we're at in terms of this whole timing issue. I think my observation, and based on my interactions with the various states in which we have generation, is most of the states are really struggling with what they're going to have to do, and without any final rules, nobody really knows what they're going to have to do, first of all. So it's really, really difficult to get this conversation going on regional cooperation. I think that's why we look at a circumstance like our integrated system, if you will, among those 6 states and say, you know what, maybe this isn't a bad model to utilize, and it's certainly not exclusive to our organization. There are a lot of utilities around the country who operate and have generation in more than one state, especially when you talk about the renewables, and likewise for coal, where you tended to build facilities where you had the resources. And so it's not just a dynamic, I think, here, it exists in other places too, and I think we have opportunities to be a little bit more creative in our approaches, where if you've got the resources here, take advantage of the resources that you have here. Take advantage of that wind generation. You know, I heard a lot of really positive things this morning in the conversation about clean coal technologies. I mean, I think everyone here would conclude that that needs to be a piece of the picture too. There are states that don't have the resources. There are states that don't have even a whole lot more access to natural gas. I can look at the state of Arizona and the state of Nevada. They're in almost worse positions because they don't have any natural resources there except potentially solar. And when you look at, you know, where they're going to get their energy from, you know, you have to step back and say, I don't know. So I think really, you know, to try to answer the question, and I can't fully answer it, but I think to try to answer the question, you really have to look at the resources that you have and how best to deploy those resources in this world in a formal or informal perspective, where you do have the ability to, you know, sell wind generation credits to another state who is going to need them to blend down their emission rate.
So one quick follow-up. You know, it's interesting, if you compare the comments of Wyoming and Utah on this point, they are, I think, diametrically opposed. Wyoming has expressed the concern that it doesn't get credits for wind generation within the state. We have talked about that, if it's exported and consumed out of state. Utah has said, I think, publicly and in its comments, that it's happy to get the benefits, the economic benefits of generation within its state, jobs created within its state, and export wind energy or solar energy, or for that matter, low-emission coal or natural gas power to neighboring states and sell, in effect, take advantage of the REC market under an RPS. So given that Wyoming does not have an RPS, but is obviously important to your service territory and your companies, what's your advice to the state of Wyoming, and given, to your point, given the enormous world-class wind resources in Wyoming, how can Wyoming best take advantage of those resources?
I'm trying to figure out a way to answer this question any differently. Again, I think it goes back to, you know, every state is going to have a different dynamic and a different driver, a different political landscape. You know, whether they're wanting to keep everything in the state, ship it out the state. You know, there are opportunities for coordination, but if a state wants to be an island, they can do that. It's just going to be that much more difficult and probably more costly for them to comply with these requirements. You know, we would look as the utility that serves both states to say, you know, let's do this in a way that is not detrimental to any of our customers. And that's a tough thing to do, but certainly to the extent that a state really does want to go it alone, I'm not sure that we have a whole lot of options there.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot twice with the same question. Let me turn to Mark and Jay on reliability. And just as a follow-up, Mark said it, I'll repeat it. I think everyone agrees that it's important to keep the lights on and that reliability, therefore, is of paramount concern. And that's true for the current administration. It's true for the utilities, for regulators. and obviously ratepayers. So is it possible, Southwest Power Pool has done a study looking at renewable integration, MISO has done some work in this area, and NERC of course has. Is it possible to achieve the renewable energy integration goals, given the challenges of interstate cooperation and coordination under the proposed plan, in a reliable way, not to sacrifice reliability? So given that wind and solar are intermittent, non-dispatchable, without storage, you've seen conflicting studies on this question. What is your thought about, and I'm not talking about achieving renewable penetration at 50% or even 30%, but rather the 22% average that EPA proposes?
Well, I as an engineer, I'm always proud that
Be sure that mic's on.
Yeah, it is on.
Okay.
That folks can kind of set a target and have the faith in engineering that we can get it done, and we can once we understand what the problems are. You took storage off the table. I hope you can put it back on, because it certainly is a technology that's growing. Though the variable generation doesn't necessarily have to have storage per se. It's just a matter of cost effectiveness of various technologies and the amount of time it takes us to put it in place, and the kind of the changing infrastructure we're going to need to make it happen. But we can do it. It's just a matter of the amount of time, and that's why I like what Jay was mentioning. We need this kind of idea of a safety valve where we get certain tight spots where we may need a little bit more time to build some of the infrastructure to support what we need. If it's a set of lines, if it's a storage facilities, if it's voltage support, et cetera. But given the sufficient time, we can build out the system the way we need it. I think where our concerns is around the amount of time provided, and I think you saw some good pictures on that. Jay?
Yeah, I agree with that. But reliability and economics are inseparable. That's one of the principles we have at Southwest Power Pool that not every one of our brethren agree to. But today's reliability problem might have been yesterday's economic lost opportunity. And transmission infrastructure isn't just built for reliability exclusively. It hopefully will make the grid more efficient and more redundant and provide lots of optionality for future resources and things down the road. One of the things to keep in mind, us engineers, I think, will be heroic and we'll keep the lights on. It's just at what cost? And clearly, if we do things as a region, there are benefits. We've shown that with our markets. I mean, we go across 8 states today, and resources are moved all over and even exported off our system. The quality of the wind in SPP is pretty phenomenal. Not quite as good as Wyoming, but pretty good, and very much spread over many states. But I think we can fix it, but I think it's going to have a cost. And that's what concerns me is to make sure that the energy we provide is affordable, and and I'm pretty certain that a regional solution is going to be a much better solution than a state-by-state approach. And I would even propose that an interregional solution will be even better, but that takes time and probably unprecedented coordination. But we can solve it if you give us time.
Let's talk about the timing issue. I led the efforts for the Department of Interior, working with the Department of Energy to try to facilitate infrastructure siting and permitting, both generation and transmission. We worked very closely with Governor Meade and his staff and many of the people in this room on Gateway West. That line has taken, 10 years now? We've permitted several segments, most of the segments in Wyoming, and now we're struggling. The department is struggling still with the Idaho segments that remain. But it is true that it is extraordinarily difficult to plan, permit, site, build transmission in a time frame that would be required. So here's the question. Does the current transmission grid in the West, without new high voltage transmission, but whatever necessary upgrades may be necessitated by virtue of the proposed rule. Do we have an adequate transmission grid in place today to integrate renewables, deal with the potential retirement of coal plants in many states throughout the West, and the redispatch of fuel to natural gas? So if we make those three major adjustments in Wyoming and other western states, do we have the grid in place today that can ensure the delivery of reliable and affordable electricity?
It's a very good question. and it's a difficult one to answer because, again, it comes down to what my colleagues have been talking about as far as what the regional plans look like. Where is that generation going to be, and where is it going to be going? As my colleague Jay indicated, we built the transmission system based on a certain, I don't know if you call it rules of the game, but basically, where folks could build generation, where load centers were, and you just can't just plop a wind farm where you have a coal-fired plant necessarily. Maybe here you can hear. I drove from Denver. It was quite persistent wind along the way, which was, I almost got blown over trying to get to the door. So that's wonderful but not everybody has that resource. And we also need to worry about planning for, wind droughts and solar droughts in certain areas too, so we need to look at all those different things. But if we know where the resources are going to be, then that helps. Now, I know that the Western Area Coordinating Council did a study where they basically did drop generation where, wind generation, et cetera, where other coal-fired plants are, and did a study and looked at the results there, and you might want to look at that study and see what the implications were. But my view is you most probably, just as they have in California and other places where they built a lot of wind, they've had to build the associated transmission system. You try to tap into the transmissions available nearby, just like you do at a gas infrastructure. You try to tap a power plant, combined cycle next to a gas pipeline, because that's your first opportunity, as well as looking for persistent wind sites. But generally, the study work we've done and working with the variable generation community, we've identified transmission being one of those factors that can be challenging. I know, Jay, you've done some studies in this in the Southwest.
Yeah, we've done several studies, and at least in SPP, and we have been engaged and monitor what's going on in West Connect and with others over here in WEC, just because we're on the other side of the DC ties. So we affect each other and need to coordinate to the extent we can. With regard to the specific question about is the West prepared, I'd really like to hear some comments from their staff here from Rocky Mountain Power Engineers and Western Area Power Administration that may have a better perspective and can share that. And maybe we can get them one of the mics. And while we're doing that, I'll just say that SPP has spent a lot of money building transmission in the plains of Southwest Power Pool over the last 4 or 5 years. And last year was a record year for building infrastructure. We installed 1,400 miles of big 345 kV lines primarily. $1.7 billion. That's a lot of money, especially when we've been typically spending about $500 million a year. And but that infrastructure will enable us to integrate probably another 30% renewable on our wires without any problem, because transmission is very lumpy. And right now we have 9,200 megawatts of wind on our wires south of the Dakotas. There's 3,000 megawatts being built as we speak, and then we're going to add the Dakotas and Montana and eastern Wyoming into SPP in this fall. That'll be another 1,000 megawatts of wind. So we have penetrations today that exceed 35% of our demand, where wind is serving 35% of our energy across the whole region at one point in time. That's pretty significant for a system that was 60% coal and 30% gas not that long ago. And there's some nuclear and hydro in that mix. But I think I'd be curious to hear the feedback from others. Please.
And please identify yourself for everybody.
Yeah. Hi, Bob Easton with Western Area Power Administration. And my footprint basically is the Rocky Mountain region, which includes Wyoming, Colorado, down to the Four Corners area, or to Glen Canyon, and down to the Phoenix area. And basically, I think just to echo what Mark had said, you know, it doesn't matter what type of megawatt you replace the coal with. It basically is location, location, location on where you put it to do the analysis correctly on the transmission side. So from my perspective, we've seen, like the study in the WEC, I think somebody mentioned, they did just that. They turned off the coal and they put gas in the same location. And sure, your transmission's going to be fine because it's just being replaced megawatt for megawatt, because you're building the transmission system to accommodate the maximum output of a gas plant or a wind plant per se. So from what I've seen, the transmission system is adequate. It'll really depend on where these new resources get located to study the transmission system properly and get it sized properly. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
And I'd add one more thing, if you don't mind, in that, and I think, you know, you've touched on it, Jay touched on it, Cathy's touched on it, and that is that, again, we're looking for a resource that provides a dynamic support to the system. It's very, you know, it's, Edison came up with a DC system. We have an AC system, an alternating current system generally. And when we remove megawatts of generation that provides a dynamic support, an inertia, a frequency response, we call them essential reliability services, and put in place other generation, they also have to be able to provide those same kind of reliability services. They can, if, like I said, you can synthesize them, but you got to spec it up front. That's all. Thank you.
So I'm going to sum up this part of the discussion with this proposition. Just tell me quickly whether you agree or disagree. E3, Energy and Environmental Economics, in its report in last summer, says a move from a state to a regional focus is needed to achieve the desired emission reductions at the lowest cost. I'll pause there. I want to add the phrase, and with the greatest reliability. Do you agree?
Not necessarily.
Can you tell us why, briefly?
Well, because I think, you know, we don't know that the regional approach is necessarily going to be the most cost-effective approach at this point. And I think that there might be variations between the transmission piece and the generation piece that may not sync up in that fashion in terms of the lower cost aspect.
Okay. Mark?
Well, I worked at a power pool most in my early career, and the power pool is a way to share reserves and transmission so that you don't have to, one organization doesn't have to build as much backup just in case there's emergency conditions. And so, you know, those regions exist today in one shape or form. And I think that, you know, and my view is that as you work with other states, you develop the resource plan together, you build the transmission together, and you say, and you share in the benefits, and you say, you know, of course I don't lean in on cost that often, but I think that, you know, as long as you follow the standards that NERC has laid out in front of industry, which industry helped write, we'll have a reliable system. But they have to, of course, meet those criteria.
Yeah, I think it's too early to tell, but my gut tells me that regional solutions would be better from a reliability and an economic perspective. It really depends how people implement the rules and what kind of resources they want to make a priority, and how much willing they are to be flexible and work with their neighbors and others as part of an overall solution that may be better. Time will tell.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn to costs, because rate shock is not something that any governor wants to face. And that's true in Wyoming, and it's also true in California, and at every end of the spectrum, political spectrum. So let's talk. I don't know what the impact of EPA's proposed rule will be on rates. And Ben, you know, your statistic this morning I thought was pretty jarring. If there's a 10% impact on electricity rates, I think you said several economists opine that will result in a 1.5% reduction in overall GDP and the loss of, I think you said, 1.5 million jobs. 1% reduction in GDP, 1.5 million jobs. I don't know if that's true or not, but clearly those consequences are unacceptable, and rate shock is unacceptable to any governor in the West. So given that, and going back to the discussion we had this morning on clean coal technologies, and Cathy, I'm going to direct this question to you, since you have so much generation and transmission assets, so many assets in the West. Would it be better simply to give states the option, and with appropriate incentives, to use carbon capture and sequestration, either with new coal power plants, supercritical plants, or with upgrades to existing plants, than to force the kind of fuel switching or new generation from renewables if the states don't have those resources available? And I'm asking the question from a cost perspective.
And the difficulty with answering the question is that we don't exactly know what that cost is. You know, it's those things that we know now, the renewables, the redispatch of natural gas, to the extent that we can quantify those compared to, you know, what do we use as the example? Is it the Kemper plant? Is it something else? And so it's very difficult. I think, should there be an option? Absolutely. You know, it has to be within the menu of options that we explore to advance compliance in the least cost fashion.
Mark or Jay, do you want to comment on that? All right. Let me ask a different question, and any of you should feel free to address this. If you were sitting at EPA today, now that you've seen not only the proposed rule, but I can't remember how many million comments in response to it, not that you've read all of them, but how would you design a clean power plan with the emission goals that, relative to where the country wants to get by 2050, say, for example, in terms of a 2-degree downward trajectory on emissions, how would you design this plan? What would you do differently?
I think it's all a matter of timing. And when you really look at it, we plan out in our organization at a minimum of 10 years. So, you know, in order to meet something in 2020, we would have had to start planning that 5 years ago. So when you come up with a plan that requires fairly short time frames within which, you know, a state only having a year to plan what its future might be for quite a while is very difficult. And then utilities planning cycles are not synced up with this either. You need the time, and I think the difficulty is, and I think EPA is starting to recognize too, that even though it came up with a set of building blocks that it applied uniformly, the results were not uniform, and we've got these disparities among the states, and we've got to address the disparities. I don't have the silver bullet for that, but the time would allow for the addressing of the disparities. The problem is, you know, if this administration is really viewing this as a legacy issue, that I think it is, I'm not sure we have as much luxury as we'd like to have.
Good. Mark?
A system that's reliable. There have been studies, and I don't know what the 2% trajectory takes you to, but there have been studies that looked at 80% renewables by 2050, I believe. We actually did a study where we looked at the state of technologies and where they were at the time, which was probably 2-3 years ago, and what were kind of like the break-even point, when do they have to be mature so that they can, you know, you can press them into service. And I think we're coming up real close to like carbon capture and sequestration. It's got to be like mature here in the next couple of years to be a good, solid contributor to the solution. Nuclear plants seem to be, by 2030, pretty much off the board, because the technology, unless you rebuild, you know, it's just a matter of wearing out the technology, and need to build new plants. And of course, not everybody desires nuclear plants as a replacement for carbon-emitting plants. And then we looked at storage. We looked at smart grids and the microgrids and distributed systems and all that. So we're able to kind of get there. But I think the silver bullet, that's why I was saying, don't take storage off the table, is going to be storage. If you mind me, take my reliability hat off and put my EPRI hat back on, because I worked at EPRI for 20 years. I can envision a day where right next to your hot water heater you got a battery, and you store it up during the day and you use it at night. I mean, it's quite possible. Nevertheless, in your automobile or whatever, which I don't know about y'all, but last time I came to Wyoming, I was driving at 100 miles an hour running through your roads, and kind of hard to do that with a 400 miles with a battery car. But maybe someday they will be able to do that. So anyway, look at that report. We did look at the different technologies which have to happen to get there by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I agree with the comments, and I do think storage is a game changer, and as well as these clean power plant emission constraints. These are drastic changes to any objective function for the grid, and it's going to take a lot of time. We do 10-year plans where we actually approve projects. We also do 20-year conceptual plans where we're trying to frame the future to help us create a roadmap for what we think this grid needs to be, and then we actually build it and approve it in our 10-year plan. I think there's been some studies done through NREL and others to look at 30% renewables by 2030, and other studies, the Western Wind Solar Integration Study, the East has done a similar study. I think you could take the results of those studies, which show that it is achievable, and we can keep the lights on and make it reliable, and the grid be flexible enough to respond and meet all the metrics that we enjoy today in terms of performance. But it's also going to create some challenges that we've never really had in terms of, as we do add more and more renewables, we may need more flexible generation, more different types of generation. I think storage, it could really fill that gap, especially electric vehicles and things like that. I just saw yesterday that Kansas City Power and Light is going to add 1,000 EV charging stations around the Kansas City metropolitan area. Clearly, they're looking toward the future, because that would support about 10,000 electric vehicles. There's less than 1,000 in service right now in the Kansas City area, so they're planning for the long term. But I think we could use things like electric vehicles as a new storage medium for the bulk power grid if we got creative enough and tried to take advantage of that technology.
Thank you, Jay. I'm going to ask one more question, bring this back to Wyoming, and then I think we have time to open this up. Lloyd, you want to give me a time check? Okay. You heard Joe Goffman say that EPA wants to have a workable plan. Wyoming has shown leadership on energy in so many ways, from clean coal, and you heard the governor mention the fracking rule, and obviously on wind development and transmission. What are, and I'll just open this up to all of you or any of you, what are some of the ways that Wyoming can help shape this rule to make it workable for the ratepayers and others who work here every day in Wyoming and live here and pay the bills? What are some suggestions you might have for the state in shaping this rule to make it workable for Wyoming? And I guess the flip side of the coin is, how would you recommend that Wyoming show leadership in the West, given its enormous energy resources? I want some good recommendations.
No, I think part of it is some of the things that are already being done. I think it's a lot of looking to the future and seeing what that future looks like in a different context. I know from a company perspective, looking at things like build out of gateway, looking at things like, implementation of the energy imbalance market. Ways to look at things that we maybe haven't before, but that enable better solutions, and that I think that's really what it comes down to is better solutions. What can the state do right now EPA has continued to engage in the discussions. They're looking for solutions. I think what you heard Joe say today was, they don't have all the answers. Bring constructive solutions to them, and I think they are more than willing to listen. And particularly if you've raised a solution in your comments, bring it back to them. Point out specifically where it is. On page 42 of my comments, we suggested this, and we'll be doing the same thing. But to say, here are some solutions. They might not be perfect, but let's have a conversation about those. And I think that's the only way that you're really going to, you got to stay active and engaged, because again, I go back to the thought that if you don't, they will only hear the other side. And hearing the thunder of the other side does not come up with creative solutions.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to that, because I think Cathy is onto something here, and that is that Wyoming didn't end up where it is today by mistake. They had a vision of where they were going to be. I remember when you start building the Laramie River, that just shows you how old I am. And Powder River coal being available, and now variable generation. I mean, this was a vision and a plan. So with the EPA rules that they're considering now, that doesn't necessarily change that Wyoming's not going to be the energy leader. It's a matter of now building a vision that other states can build off of and grow with. And because no matter what's going to happen, just if you look at where natural gas is coming out now, and our history has changed over time. We've seen changes in the resource mix. It's a matter of adapting, and if Wyoming wants to continue to be the leader in energy, I think you've got a great platform to start that process.
I don't have much to add. That was great, both those comments. And I do encourage you to keep collaborating with organizations that within the state as well as adjacent to the state to maybe look for mechanisms that can get more efficient dispatch, for example, to lower the emissions from individual aggregate dispatch decisions, things like that. But I think there's a lot of options. Just got to look for solutions that are win-win. And they're probably out there.
All right, thank you, Jay, and thank you, members of the panel. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn it to you for our first question, and then we'll open it up to others after the board.
Sort of a statement and then a question. It seems like, I think intuitively, we all know that fully functioning markets are really the most efficient, and typically the person at the end of the line benefits most from an efficient market. I think intuitively we see that, something that functions really well. When you take a look at what's happening in the West, I mean, we have the economic signals. We're going to have environmental signals. We're going to have reliability signals that are all market signals. So you got the market signals, you've got the participants, the market participants, you got the market realities, and unless conversations happen in a way that have never happened before in the West, there's not going to be any way to get all those, to have those conversations in a way to create the kind of alignment that you need to really have an efficient market that works for the guy at the end of the line. And so, yeah, I mean, we need to do this, we need to do that, but I mean, it seems like, and maybe it's happening in the West, and I'm not aware of it, and that wouldn't surprise me at all. But if it's not happening, what are tangible things that we can do to create the space, Steve, to have those tangible conversations of how can we create awareness of those issues in the market, then how can we begin to create the conversation that helps us really understand what alignment looks like between our market signals, our market participants, and the market interests. I think that's what needs to happen. Don't know if it's already happening or where to start, but it feels to me, based on what I've heard from this fantastic panel, is trying to articulate that and pick one or two things that need to be done in the West and how Wyoming can help lead that.
I think that's an excellent question, and let me just offer my suggestions, but then open it up to others. you know, the Western governors, Western states have a history and a tradition of working collaboratively together. And I think Wyoming's leadership and power of convening in the West would be very important and very valuable. So starting the conversation. And I think, you know, you heard it from all of the panelists, EPA is quite open to proposed solutions, and it would be very valuable and very worthwhile, I think, for Western states, and particularly Wyoming and Idaho and Utah and Colorado, particularly your immediate neighbors, the Dakotas, to sit down and brainstorm opportunities to partner, identify solutions, figure out what those market signals are and how you each view those market signals. We don't have a price on carbon, so that's, although there is environmental policy in this country, that's the one market signal that's not very clear. And I think a lot of utilities and companies have already planned for carbon constraints, like we're seeing in the proposed plan, and have assigned a price, therefore, on carbon internally, but it's not a transparent signal. And so in that respect, the market is not efficient and it's not working in the way it should. But other than that, I think the data are out there, the information's out there, and it would be really valuable for Governor Mead, yourself, this board to convene a conversation about how to craft solutions that work for Wyoming. That's my opinion. Others?
Yeah, I would just add that some of those conversations are happening. I think we're seeing an enhanced level of communication that we've never seen in the past. I mean, just the fact that EPA is out doing so much outreach is remarkable compared to the EPA of the past. But various groups are convening. I think that it needs to be kicked up a notch, so to speak. And I think what these groups have done to date has really been identifying what the problem is. And again, it really goes back to, so now we all know what the problem is. Now it's identifying the solution, and you know, you're absolutely right with respect to efficient markets. Okay. We all learned that in sort of the Econ 101 class.
Let's open it up for questions.
But people forget about that too frequently.
Right.
Yeah, I know that FERC is going to have a workshop in Denver. I think it's mid-March. I may be off a little bit. Is it 25th of February? I would encourage you to get on the agenda and speak and listen and be part of that dialogue. I really would.
Since Jay brought this up, it's your fault, Jay. The electrification of transportation. If you look at what Federal Highway is doing and its roadmap for its technology and connected and automated vehicles, if you believe, and let's, for the sake of argument, say, believe this, that by 2030 you can have a significant amount of capability in vehicles that can drive in a semi-automated way. And the logic that follows that is there are a lot of electrified vehicles and powertrains that come along with that. I'm just curious that when y'all did your comments and you thought about the impacts, how have you factored in increased load demand for electrified vehicles, the benefits of storing power in the batteries and net metering aside? When you look at the CO2 emissions from transportation fuels and power plants, they're roughly equal. And if you solve the problem at the stack, it's a lot easier way to do it than solving it at a tailpipe. And so if you migrate transportation into a more electrified version, you got all the CO2 reduction that's now fully layered on top of the generating capacity transmitted to the load market. So I'm just wondering if in any of your comments and your forward-looking thinking that matches up pretty closely with some of the other comments about 2030 coming along, and here's the retirement of all these, coal generation, et cetera. How does all that play out, and was that even part of the calculus that y'all are looking at?
I think that's a great question and point that we need to get our hands around. Based on my understanding of our models and our analysis and our data, I don't think we've reflected that in the work to date. And I like how you're trying to look holistically at the overall CO2 emissions and not just existing generation, but what's it do to the transportation space, and give people some credit if we could make that happen. But I think you're onto something really big there. But to my knowledge, we haven't really got our hands around that yet in terms of the analytics that the power engineers have done to date.
There has been some study work, though, on looking when you charge, and so, and as much as, you know, wind in some places seems to blow, you know, like when you really don't need it nowadays, which is in the evening, except for here, of course. But and so that's a good time then to charge automobiles or other applications of electricity. And so we build to a peak generally, though it's nice to have that in evening hours to do maintenance and that kind of thing, and cooling off transformers and what have you. But you know, the thought is that it doesn't necessarily impact the peak that much, right? Which is what you build your capacity to. It kind of fills in the valleys a little bit more. I'm trying to remember who did this study. I thought the IRC may have had some work on that. I can't remember. Yeah.
And I'll say we did not specifically address transport electrification in our comments. You know, frankly, as an industry, I think it's just an issue now that we're starting to reconcile. The Edison Electric Institute is starting to make a bigger push to, you know, be more supportive of transportation electrification. The difficulty, of course, is with what's typically been that relationship with the auto industry and getting some of that pushback. So there has been some reluctance in the past, I think. But, you know, I can go back 20 years and we were talking about the same issue. So, you know, shame on us that we didn't take advantage of opportunities that existed years ago. But we can't do anything about the past. We can only change the future. And, you know, great point.
Thanks. Yeah. In fact, I was at the CalISO meeting in June, and they have about 100,000 electric vehicles. And their next step policy for their climate change is to accelerate electrification of their transportation sector. And as their, of course, their renewable portfolio standards, they now have overgeneration during the day due to sun, so they could actually charge vehicles during the day if you have charging stations at your place of work. So all these dynamics of the distributed generation. I noticed, Cathy, on your comment, you had distributed generation. I kind of want to get to that. What does that mean to you? What do you see how that's changing if the supply is local versus over the long-distance transmission distributions? And if any of that is sort of combustion-based or fuel cell technology, and so you shut down large, big emission central sources, but now you have hundreds of millions of smaller emission sources and all this recommendation for small combined heat and power in your home. Seems like some of those are inconsistent with the overall climate change regulation. So I have some comments along that one.
Well, far be it from, for us to ensure consistency in our policies, right? I mean, this is part of the problem, of course, in the United States in general, because we haven't had a unified energy policy, and so now we're always in the role of having environmental policy often drive what our energy policy is, rather than having kind of the reverse and having the environmental benefits of our energy policy come along. So again, I think there are a whole host of unintended consequences out there that we can only imagine at this point. And that's why, to a certain extent, we have to move quickly, but we also have to move slowly to make sure that we don't make those big mistakes.
I would add, I liken this whole progress to being like, my dad worked for IBM, and I remember the 360s and the 1401s. How many people are old enough to remember 360s? IBM 360s, good. Big centralized computing systems. Now PCs and cell phones, right? Distributed systems. And what was the backbone that ties it all together is the internet. So we need to have some sort of way to optimize, I don't know what entrepreneur will come up with this idea, but it's obviously after my time, to be able to coordinate all of that. And I still think there'll be a need for a bulk system anyway to provide the frequency and the inertia to support that system somehow. It'll be a different model for certain, but an interesting one, that's for sure. Yeah.
I don't have much to add. I do agree that we're still going to need the bulk EHV backbone system to help us deal with intermittency and backup services and things like that, even with microgrids. But I think you raise a good point about all these distributed, internal combustion machines and looking at their effects on the environment versus these big, efficient, large machines that were put in for a reason because of the economies of scope and scale.
All right, with apologies, we have used our time, but please feel free to approach any of us, especially the panel members, during the break. I want to thank our panel members. This was terrific. Thank you for being here today. Great questions and great answers. Members of the board, thank you. I want to acknowledge Elisa Ferguson for her help in conceiving this panel and working with the chairman and Lloyd to put it together. So thanks for hosting us.
So let's give them a hand. Also, so this time next year, the final standards will be published. You all will have started to quantify the impacts, and in reference to Ben's comment about, because I think rates are going to go up more than 10%. So if it's going to cost us 1.5 million jobs per 10%, we're talking about a lot of jobs and a lot of impact to the GDP. So I'm sure none of you have a problem with coming back this time next year. We'd love to have you. Super job. Seriously. Great question. Steve, everybody, thank you so much. Give them another hand, please.
Thank you, Lloyd.